Yesterday, Jeremy Hunt delivered the budget, probably the last before the next general election, and his fourth fiscal event since becoming Chancellor in October 2022, after replacing Kwasi Kwarteng.
Whatever the pressures and whatever the politics, a Conservative government working with the Bank of England will always put sound money first.
Non-doms have been abolished, national insurance has been cut by 2p, a vaping tax has been introduced, and the NHS has been promised £3.4 billion towards a digital transformation. But while inflation remains high and most of the nation is still feeling the prolonged squeeze of the cost of living crisis, will these proposals make any real difference? OK, the budget.
Yeah.
Freddie, you were in the chamber for most of it.
20 minutes.
I was in the chamber for all of it.
You sustained. You
I
did
sustained.
Well.
What was the vibe like?
So I think it was quite rowdy. You could obviously feel it was an election year. People on both sides of the aisle were shouting. Jonathan Ashworth, I think, raised his voice maybe 4 or 5 times. He was very passionate. But Jeremy Hunt had this very strange demeanour. He was reading the budget out, and then he'd look up every 3 or 4 minutes, deliver a joke, and then start reading the budget again. And it was awful. I couldn't watch it. So I went upstairs to the cafe and got a cupcake and watched it on my laptop instead.
Well, you do need sugar to sustain you through big set pieces like Budget Day. Will, you are an expert in all things finance and business. Like, what were your main takeaways? What was this budget about?
Well, firstly, I'd say I think it was more braying than shouting.
Yes, yeah.
It felt like a bray.
How do you define a bray?
Well, I think it's an ovine or bovine noise, something of the farmyard about it. But it certainly it felt like there was a real wall of rah behind Hunt, especially when he trotted out his bad jokes about Keir Starmer needing to lose weight, or Angela Rayner and her council house neglecting to mention the 7 luxury flats that
which no one outside of Westminster
Southampton
will understand or have any idea what's going on.
He called her Angela, though, which you're really not meant to do. It's meant to be the Honourable Lady, and I was quite surprised that he didn't get... I thought it was quite patronising, to be honest. It was patronising. I was surprised he didn't get picked up for that. But on the content of the budget.
Yes, on the actual money front, it felt to me like a budget that was aimed at people who make about 50 grand, which seems to me about as politically astute as you can get, given the money that is available to him to give away to people. So the NICS cut, National Insurance cut, is only a net giveaway over the next few years for people between 32 grand and 55 grand, once you account for fiscal drag, which is the freezing of the thresholds at which people start paying tax or start paying the higher rate of tax. So you only actually get more money if you're on sort of 32 to 55 grand. And the people who get the most net gain from that are in the sort of 50 grand region. Those people have also, if they're parents, they've been spared one of these really big marginal tax rises that is a feature of our tax system in the form of the high income child benefit charge. So child benefit in this country is a bit mad in that if you earn over 50 grand or now 60 grand after this budget, then you can still claim it, but you have to pay some of it back. And thousands of people a year get caught out by that. They don't realise that that's the case. And it also leads to a kind of a very high marginal rate of tax. So the tax that you pay on an extra pound that you earn for people between 50 and 60 grand before this budget, and now sort of 60 grand and upwards after this budget. So that is still there, but potentially that would encourage people on around that amount to, do some more training or go for another promotion or something like that. So there's a good reason for doing that, but it does sort of move the cliff a bit rather than removing it. And then you've got not just the net benefit, but the amount that people will see in their pay packets. So if you are on minimum wage full-time, sort of 35 hours a week, you're getting a little bit less than 19,000 a year. And as a result of that NICS cut, you will get an extra £10.65 in your pay packet each month, which is
That's the election then.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's not a huge amount. If you're on 50 grand, you get nearly 6 times that, despite earning about 2.5 times as much. And to be honest, a couple on around 50 grand a year each, especially if they have kids, if they're getting an extra 120 quid a month in their pay, and they're allowed to claim more child benefit, or rather they don't have to pay more back, then actually that net benefit could add up to a recognisable difference in their incomes, given the squeeze on the cost of living at the moment. GDP per capita has still not recovered to the level it was at the end of 2019. So people definitely feel poor. And
which is 5 years without economic growth.
Yeah.
That's remarkable. I mean, Jeremy Hunt made this strange point during his speech where he kept saying that Labour need to start seeing GDP on a per capita basis, which I asked Labour and they said that they will do so. But it's remarkable because when you look at GDP growth on a per capita basis, it just shows that the Conservative government hasn't been able to stimulate any economic growth over the past 5 years. Yeah. So all of the sort of, each month we get some figures and maybe we're in a recession, maybe we're not, maybe there's 0.2% growth. Well, if you look at it on a per capita basis, which is the important measure, we've gone nowhere.
Yeah.
And the thing that sort of stood out to me in the OBR figures that accompany the budget is the fact that living standards are going to be lower at the end of this parliament than at the start, which isn't news in itself. I think the IFS did some research a couple of months ago that suggested that households are going to be on average £1,900 worse off at the end of the parliament than they were in 2019. But it's still pretty stark to have that going into an election year. I say going into election year. We're in an election year, continuing in this never-ending election year. There had been lots of speculation that it was going to be the last budget before the election. It was going to be a budget that paved the way for the election. I remember when Hunt announced in December that it was going to be on the 6th of March, which is very early in March, that was taken as a sign that the Conservatives were planning a May election. We had all these signals that there could be a May election with the last national insurance cut coming in January. Freddie, did this feel like a May election budget to you?
No.
Good answer.
And I know Labour have been briefing extremely hard for months now that it will be a May election. I saw no reason for it to be so. I don't think the polls have in any way returned to where they need to be for the Conservatives to call that election. And I also think that the psychological impact of Rishi Sunak being Prime Minister for 2 years in October will outweigh everything.
Well, John Elledge thinks it will be 2025 just because then Sunak can say that he's been Prime Minister from 2022 to 2025, which sounds more impressive.
Which is all really sad, but it's also true. I mean, Rishi Sunak's a very young man. He's going to have a career for 40 years or 20 years or whatever after he leaves office. He will care about these things. Politicians are proud people.
Can we talk about growth? Because growth is sort of the centrepiece of what both Labour and the Conservatives are trying to do, or what they think needs to happen. Hunt kept talking about growth. Is there any hope in this budget? Is there any hope in the OBR forecasts?
I think if you look at the forecasts of other external analysts, people like banks, then they tend to say that the OBR forecasts are fairly optimistic, which is, first of all, a bit difficult for Jeremy Hunt in that he has left himself an extremely small amount of fiscal headroom, so the amount of tax he can cut or extra spending he can promise before he comes up against his own fiscal rules. So the average amount that in the past that chancellors leave themselves of room for error against those rules is a bit over 26 billion. This budget leaves Hunt with a bit less than 9 billion in terms of like the wiggle room against those rules. If productivity growth is out against the OBR's projections by 1/4 percentage point, then that would probably cost about 10 billion in terms of receipts, and that would mean that the fiscal rules he's not meeting his fiscal rules. So it's really, really, really tight, which I think is for me one point in favour of saying actually maybe an election would be earlier, because it would be so difficult to squeeze any more election-friendly promises out of the current state of the economy in the autumn. But yeah, I mean, you guys know the politics of this a lot better than I do. So, and it's also really good to hear that Rishi Sunak is a young man in his mid-40s.
I'm trying to be
Very
kind to him.
encouraging.
I think the political fundamentals haven't changed. That was the key thing. We had the 2p cut in national insurance in the autumn statement. He did it again, and I don't think we're going to see a different result. We've still got those spending cuts penciled in for after the election.
Very, very deep.
Very deep
spending cuts.
And that's because even though overall public service spending is going up, you have these protected departments around aid, defence, the NHS, which means that you have to cut pensions, which means, benefits, all those things that automatically go up, which means that you have to cut other areas. I think David Gauke wrote in his column for us this week that it would lead to a 7% decrease in money for prisons, which means that you're going to have to cut prison officers by about 4,000 people, I think it was, which they tried to do in the 2010s. And I think he was Secretary of the Treasury, and he was working with the prison minister to do so. And they essentially said, well, you can't really run a prison on that number of police officers. So it's not sustainable for us to institute these cuts. So that's why Gauke described it as a work of fiction yesterday. And I think that's been the case for a while, so I don't think that's new. There was some speculation that Jeremy Hunt might cut even further into public service spending, but he didn't do so. And then we've also got this fledgling divide between Labour and the Tories on tax cuts. This seems to me to be the key area in which Number 10 is trying to strike a divide with the opposition. We're going to cut your taxes to fund growth. Labour are going to raise taxes or increase investment to fund growth. That's the line. We can disagree whether it's a real line, but that's the line that they're trying to draw. Will that work? I don't think so, in part because of these other economic factors that we've been talking about: low growth, cost of living crisis, the fact that standard of living, it won't increase until, I think, 25, 26. So these are the fundamentals, and I think even if the Conservative government tries to say to people, they're going to raise your taxes and we're going to cut them, I don't think it will cut through just because of the broader picture.
Let's talk about Labour's response, or actually what the Conservatives were trying to do to Labour and the position they were trying to force Labour into, because scrapping the non-dom tax status, Labour policy that was intended to fund all kinds of things like school breakfast clubs and extra dentist appointments.
MRIs, scanners.
Yeah, all kinds of things. And extending the windfall tax on oil and gas companies, another Labour policy that was meant to pay for green investment and insulation and investment in green power and all those kinds of things. Now, both of those were briefed out or rumoured beforehand. And so I think Labour were ready for the idea that the Conservatives might steal their policies. But is it as much of a trap for them as the Conservatives think it is to say, OK, you've earmarked this money for these investments, we're going to take that money and put it towards tax cuts? Or does it make them look weak because they copied Labour's ideas? Or is there some other way that Rachel Reeves can raise that money now that it's been diverted to tax cuts rather than breakfast clubs and NHS?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it matters that much. I don't think it's going to cut through that much overall. I think it was a wise political move from the Conservatives given the constraints in which they were working, because it forced Labour to reassess how they're going to fund all these promises. What they've said is they're going to stick with the promises, which for a week or so was uncertain, and they're not going to raise taxes. So what does that mean? That means they're going to go into the £1.2 trillion that the state spends every single year and try and find a couple of £1 billion to fund these things.
Efficiency savings.
Efficiency savings, reform, whatever it might
Productivity.
be. Exactly. So I think it just showed how ridiculous the narrative, the daily narrative of announcements of let's spend another 100 million on mental health or whatever it might be, that really doesn't really correlate with reality. It's much, as the OBR pointed out, it's almost much more important whether the Houthis actually shut down the Red Sea trade route as to whether we can afford more MRI scanners than it is if we institute this non-dom tax.
What about the NHS productivity plan? Because that was it really felt like Hunt just kind of went off on a little tangent talking about digital transformation in the NHS for about 10 minutes and new IT systems and all kinds of things like that. And then he went back to talking about the budget, and everyone sort of woke up for a moment. This is
Hey, that was the best bit for me.
that was the best bit for
Yeah.
you. Go on, tell us about your
Do you
favourite
like
bit.
the idea of an AI filling out your doctor's notes?
No, I just like the idea of our doctors having computers and not doing everything through fax machines and what have you. I mean, that's the
I mean,
point,
they have
isn't it?
computers and they don't work, I think.
Well,
isn't it?
there you go. I mean, saying we really need to increase productivity in public services is obviously true, but I think it shows the depth of the problems that we have, that we even have to flag this as some ambitious plan. But the interesting thing on that is it's also a Labour policy. Labour's whole thing is about making the public services much more efficient. We've got Wes Streeting, who constantly speaks about the importance of technology, AI, in reforming the NHS, not just giving the NHS more money, but making it more efficient. So again, I think Labour are setting the political narrative. The drumbeat is coming out of Keir Starmer's office, to which the Conservatives are dancing to.
Do you think it's a bit of a sort of silver bullet thinking, though, to get up and talk about, doctors not going to have to type out forms because an AI will do it for him, when, really, I guess it would be more boring, but more effective to talk about where your doctor's computer will run a newer version of Windows because we'll have sorted out the enormously wasteful IT contracts on which so much money is wasted.
And there's so much lack of productivity in the NHS caused by broken equipment, whether that's like a broken MRI machine or a broken printer. Like if you add up all of I think it's in the billions, the amount of, just forget new equipment, the amount of like, could you fix the equipment that we have? So it felt a bit like Rishi Sunak really likes his AI, doesn't he? He likes sort of Silicon Valley, the computers will solve everything, when like they would really like their MRI machine to be fixed, and it's quite mundane, but really, really helpful.
Yeah, perhaps politically that doesn't make much difference at all. But I wonder how keen voters are on that kind of technological solutionism versus we're going to fill in the potholes.
Yeah, we've discussed this before, haven't we? Does AI create fear, or does it create aspiration and hope?
Yeah.
And I think it often depends. I mean, I'm just speculating here, but I think it often depends on whether you're in a recession or the economy's doing quite well. You can sort of see that in the way that people lean towards security, or that you lean towards risk, depending on their economic situation.
On some of the taxes that were raised or not raised, fuel duty frozen, which is the least surprising thing ever. Every budget they go, oh, we're going to raise it. No, we're not going to raise it. Alcohol duty, new tax on vapes. I got the sense that there was a bit of confusion over, like, it's not good to be vaping, but it's okay to be drinking. There's a sort of certain amount of what vice taxes are acceptable and which ones aren't. Will, like, what's the cultural impact of some of these tax changes?
Yeah, I think they're supporting the great British pub is obviously, culturally significant. There's always seems to be something about booze in the budget, isn't it? I mean, obviously, alcohol duty is a big thing, but it's all part of the kind of that sort of braying. The Chancellor's, he's allowed to have a whiskey up at the ballot box, isn't he? There's some.
I think Ken Clarke was the last one.
Yeah, there's a bit of law, But
Rishi Sunak obviously doesn't drink.
Yeah.
And whenever Rishi Sunak talks about alcohol, he gives off the impression of somebody who's like very obviously doesn't drink and has never trying to talk about something that he knows nothing about. But there was that advert that Labour did a couple of months ago or last year, where it was Rishi Sunak cutting the tax on champagne when he was Chancellor and comparing that to the cost of living crisis. So there are aspects where, even though it's a relatively small amount of money, the tax on booze cuts through in a way that other ones don't. And obviously as well, ending the war on the motorist, which the Conservatives are really keen on. I'm a driver. I haven't noticed the war on the motorist.
No, I guess driving is a necessity, and drinking is culturally important. I guess so you're necessity. Some of us,
especially at the
certainly in
moment.
journalism. Certainly, if you've just listened to Jeremy Hunt speaking for an hour. The other thing about the pubs is that they face much greater challenges than small increases in alcohol duty. The cost of energy has been catastrophic. There is major cultural change around drinking, around pubs, and they are. very sadly closing in very large numbers.
It's also staffing as well,
Yeah.
and business rates. And we've had a lot in the last couple of days about whether London is a 24-hour city or not. The answer being it very much is not.
It's not even a 12-hour city.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sadly, they do face much greater challenges, but I think that probably is something that is quite important to voters when they see, these sort of community hubs, which a nice pub can be, disappearing, especially, I would imagine among rural voters.
And finally, Freddie, Jeremy Hunt has his own battle in his own constituency to contend with. Were there moments when Hunt was not the Chancellor, but just a local constituency MP trying to fight for a seat?
Yeah, Jeremy Hunt's Twitter feed at the moment is purely about Surrey, where his seat is, and I think where the Lib Dems are really trying to unseat him. And you've got to remember there are many senior Tories in the cabinet and also senior backbenchers who are facing extinction. So I think that was part of the reason that you had him outline and reference all of the constituent MPs who had lobbied him on that and lobbied him on this, and it was so that they could put it in their leaflets. I mean, this for the Tories was supposed to be a general election campaign, something that set out their stall, but I don't think it will make a difference. I spoke to one Tory MP yesterday. I was like, it will make no difference. It is madness, is what they said. They're just resigned. I think we need to stop thinking that this is just a normal budget in a normal election year. The polling is absolutely awful. I don't think we should overstate the certainty of Labour's victory. And if you look at the numbers of the volatility of voters and the number of swing voters and undecideds, there's still maybe a game to play for. But within the Conservative mindset, I do think many of them are giving up.
Thanks so much for watching. We'd love to know what you think. Please make sure you leave your comments below. And if you enjoyed watching this podcast, you can watch more of our videos on our YouTube channel. And don't forget to like and subscribe.